So this bonus video is designed to show off some new techniques for making stone floors magnetic, making magnetic interior walls, and an updated version of how to make the magnetic wood floors, which I will add directly to that video because on Patreon I can do that and only lose the comments, unlike YouTube where I'd lose a lot more. Welcome to the archive. I started with the floor tiles. I cut these to the usual 3 inches in size and cut 1-inch slits on the sides to help with lining up and measuring later. I then used one of these handy 3D printed jigs, free STL on Patreon by the way, to measure and added some magnets, and then trimmed 1/16 of an inch from the top and hot glued in nickel strips at the edges, about 1/8 of an inch in and covering at least 1/2 inch from the edge, basically where the steel wire was in the original wood tiles method. I used scissors to press this stuff into the foam, which basically means I could glue it in without it sticking out and messing with the top layer. These were a stroke of genius from Matt, not me, another Matt, one of the patrons, who realised that nickel was just as magnetic as steel and a lot less problematic to cut. These are an upgrade from the idea that I did have for this, which I also showed off in the upgraded wood tiles video. That idea still works, this is just slightly better. I used 1.5mm thick, 15mm wide nickel strips for this. If yours are thinner, say 8mm, which was another option I saw, you might want to double layer them side by side to get the right width. The hot glue is a temporary measure, it won't hold indefinitely. Luckily it doesn't really have to because we need to glue the top back on. To do this I used a thick layer of tacky glue all over the tile, and that is important so no little tiles flake off later, and laid them down under a heavy object to dry in a stack. I did all this before cutting and texturing, otherwise it's kind of difficult to glue it back in place. When I cut the top off, I did it with a low temperature hot wire, Mark 1 on my Proxxon. Any hotter than this and the gap will be wider, which means that your tile will be shorter. Not a huge deal, but worth bearing in mind. I used a knife to cut up the squares. I still went with a subtle inch grid as it can be useful in confined spaces, but I aimed to disguise it by cutting each square fairly randomly. I started with a cut halfway across and then broke it up from there, either cutting halfway, 1/3 of the way, or 1/4 of the way across. On the first tiles, I kept this pretty rigid, always starting with a cut halfway across, but by the end I'd reached a nice randomized balance with some more broken up tiles. From there I widened them ever so slightly with a sharp object like this sculpting tool, not a biro like I've shown in the past, because again, it's too thick and it makes the gaps, well, too wide. I also lined up the tiles together and ran it between them to make sure that there were similar gaps when they were connected. I did still add some ragged edges and cracks with a knife in the middle, but I did this much more sparingly than in my original tiles, which I just felt were too heavily weathered. Texturing was just tinfoil as usual. I didn't bother using Milliput to fill the gaps at the sides between the bottom of the tile and the top, though I did texture the side of the tile gently to add texture but still keep them smooth at the top. I find the thin top layer makes it look more like realistic stonework and less like a fairly obvious dungeon tile. What I did do on the other hand was try out some of this Woodland Scenics foam putty on the magnets to seal them in and cover over the appearance. This stuff feels like wall filler, spackle for the Americans, but I suspect there's more to it. The end result is actually pretty good. It gives a smooth finish which isn't brittle and doesn't crack on impact. It actually bends and indents more like foam if you do push into it. Provided the paint job lasts with use, which it seems to have done so far, this is going to be my new go-to for covering over gaps in foam, most places where I would have used Milliput in the past. Though I would still use Milliput on things like the stair blocks though. This stuff has the consistency of wall filler, so sculpting details into it is not so easy. I am going to try carving details into it once it's dry though. That should be interesting. Anyway, this gives us tiles that are magnetic on top, which is perfect for interior walls, or even keeping stair blocks in place. The interior walls are pretty simple. The basic shape and texture you can do identically to the upgraded magnetic stone walls, albeit 1.5 inches tall rather than 2 inches, with steel wire in the gap 1/2 inch from the top on both sides, pushed in the gap just like the main upgraded magnetic walls I've shown previously. A steel wire on top is a neat little addition that not only lets the walls stack if you want to for some reason, but also opens them up to having magnetic toppers attached. For example, you can make a thin stonework layer with a small magnet in and use them as exterior walls for a noble's garden or a cemetery. This is a rough example without the toppers. I have shinier plans for this sort of thing in the future. So with that done, the only change is the magnets at the bottom. The side magnets are identical to the normal walls, 1/2 inch from the top, which means they neatly attach to other walls. Nice, right? I originally did this design with 6mm by 4mm magnets, the big beastie kind that I've used in some of my other videos. But these were just too strong, they tore out a lot and generally played havoc. So instead, I ended up using 6mm by 2mm magnets, embedded slightly deeper than flush, with a circle blob of hot glue around the edge, which I then trim flat when it's completely cool. This not only helps them not tear out when storing them, it also makes them easier to attach and remove from the floor tiles. And it's cheaper. As for polarity, you want these magnets on the bottom to mirror the magnets on the edges of floor tiles. So north on one side, south on the other. It doesn't actually matter which way around you do this, as long as you keep it consistent across all of your tiles in relation to the magnets that are on the sides. So either they all have south on the left and north on the right for both the sides and the bottom, or they have south on the left for the side but south on the right for the bottom, and north on the other side respectively. But I just put south on the left and match them up. Makes it easier. With this polarity, you can get the walls to stick to the steel wires or nickel strips at any point in the middle, while at the edges using the pull of the side magnets of the tile to attach them, the one way that they will let you. But this is more than enough to place walls on top of tiles, around the outside of other tiles, much like you would if those areas were open space with outside walls. What makes it even easier is if you've used nickel strips for all of your floors. Then the nickel overrides the side magnet pull, and your bottom magnets could be pretty much whatever polarity you damn well please. But I'd still go with north-south, because then they'll work on dirt tiles, cave tiles, volcanic tiles, you get the picture. I made matching height columns for these, but I tried out using nickel strips hot glued on instead of magnets, because these don't need to connect together to be used as a freestanding column. Again, I sealed these strips on by pressing them in and sealing the edge with hot glue, cutting off the excess once rock hard. Though this does work, I'm going to revert to magnets. These columns don't ping satisfyingly perfectly into place. They require a little bit of fiddling to get exactly where you want them, which is a little bit annoying. It is cheaper though, so there's an option. I also made these columns 9/16 of an inch square instead of a round ½ inch, at least for most of them. This means they stick out a little, which I think adds some nice flavour. On top of that, I made a few with connections on parallel sides and ½ an inch square. These are perfect for interior walls that need to stretch over the corner of a building, or just when you need to stretch a wall out a bit. Doors and half walls are done more or less exactly as you'd expect. The steel wire on top really helps keep the thin bit sturdy, while the rest is exactly the same as an upgraded magnetic door, including the magnets in the wall to hold the new style doors with steel wire on the edge. These work a lot better for interior walls than the previous design, and make them far smoother than the old style doors. Half walls and half doors are something I added for flexibility. Half walls are literally exactly what you think they are. Cut an interior wall in half and make sure the newly cut sides are textured and have a magnet. Done. Having pairs of half walls, one north, one south at the bottom, means you should always have one of the polarity that you need. The one downside of this is if your half walls make a full wall sit half and half on two tiles. If the tile isn't nickel stripped, it'll jump forward a bit to grab the steel wire, but this mostly doesn't happen as long as they're connected to a wall on both sides. This is a minor issue, but I thought it was worth mentioning if you started with the steel wire method like I have. Having all of your floors with nickel strips makes this functionally irrelevant, to the extent that I'm tempted to rip the tops of my wood tiles off and add nickel strips and resurface them again, because I'm a little bit obsessive. It's totally optional, but this is definitely the way you want to do it if you haven't started with your floor tiles yet. Finally, half doors are a little bit different. Combined with the normal 3-inch doors with the door in the centre, they allow you to place a door pretty much anywhere on a wall. These really don't need magnets on the bottom. They will almost always have wall tiles at least on one side, if not on two. But you could add magnets to the bottom just like all of the other walls. There is space. But magnets on the bottom of these half walls won't line up with the magnets on the sides of floors, so these would only really work on nickel stripped floor tiles. I hope this has been a valuable bonus video. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel. It's literally the only reason I get to do these videos to the kind of depth, quality, and level of experimentation that leads to these kind of results, instead of me needing to chase higher views and release videos more regularly just to keep the channel afloat. I massively appreciate your support, and until next time, I'll be in the archive.